Welcome to the third episode of the Teaching with Purpose podcast, when the series is Cracking the Code. Our podcast is for parents, it's for students, it's for teachers, it's for administrators, it's for school board members, community members who want to basically make a difference in the educational system. We still have a huge plague in our system in terms of gaps, right? We have a huge disproportionate discipline gap. We have an achievement gap. We have, and it all basically contributes to a wealth gap. So we still have some major problems in the school system since the 70s, since the beginning of integration, I would say. So we have a special guest today here. We have the renowned speaker and writer and now Teaching with Purpose advisor, Tim Wise. If you could just please tell us who you are and what you do.
Well, I'm a anti-racism educator, activist, writer, author, speaker. So, for the last 26, 27 years, I've been going around the country talking with community groups, colleges, universities, high schools, middle schools, teachers, government employees, union folk, whatever, about issues of racial equity in schooling, the justice system, housing, the labor market, all throughout the society and all the different institutions. So, I suppose anti-racism educator is the short, business card description of what it is that I am and what I do.
Yeah, excellent. So how important is that work currently in this political time now?
Well, that's like the softball question of all softball questions, right? It's sort of like asking if folks like long walks on the beach.
Yeah.
And,
So with that, right? How would you define the current time?
Yeah, I mean, the current moment is obviously, I think, both a really dangerous moment in the sense that some incredibly reactionary forces are now in charge of every branch of government, including, of course, with the Trump administration, and it's pretty clear hostility toward Muslim folk, toward immigrants, particularly of color, particularly those who they perceive to be or maybe are undocumented, and as well, hostility toward black folks in large cities who they are prepared apparently to turn the cops over on as if the cops weren't already well embedded in those communities and often misbehaving. So there's a lot of danger in this moment with regard to racial equity. Having said that, I think it's also a huge opportunity because for the last 8 years of the Obama administration, we have been hearing people telling us, those of us who talk about race, that we don't have to talk about it anymore because the black guy's president, so everything's cool, everything's chill. We obviously have, conquered racism. And I think now, at the very least, we can say that there are some folks who are waking up to the realization that that 8-year dream they had was faulty. And that it was an illusion. So maybe if we're prepared to take advantage of this moment, even though it's a very frightening moment in terms of racism, there is an opportunity now while the blinders are off, while the scab has been removed and while people's eyes have been sort of focused on this, to hopefully activate people in realizing the obligations that they have to create racial justice. The problem is we have to strike quickly because what we know from history is people's eyes get open and then they hit that snooze button and they go back to bed. And so, after Katrina, we had a moment where everybody said, oh my God, how could this happen in America? And like 72 hours later, or a week later, or 2 weeks later, everybody was back to sleep. So, we have to take advantage of these openings, even in the midst of real danger.
So what are some things that once people are activated, what are some things that people can do?
Well, I mean, I think it's different for different folks, right? Different people are going to be, likely to become active in very different ways. Not everyone is going to go to a demonstration or a march or show up at a meeting and speak on the microphone to the school board or to the state legislature or whatever. That's not everybody's bag. Some people will, and if they are willing to do that, they should. But at the very least, getting active means, let's think about it in the context of schooling. It means, getting together with other parents and showing up at those school board meetings, even if not everyone's going to talk, just to show a presence of people who are concerned about these issues. It means going in and working with the teachers and the administrators to help them program for equity. A lot of times we have teachers and principals who might want to do the right thing, who might want to infuse their curriculum with a more multicultural approach or anti-racist approach, but they don't necessarily know how because you can't teach what you don't know. On the other hand, you got folks in the community who might know that stuff, who might be experts in that material, who might be able to bring something to it, so they can go in and work with the school to try to reach out to the community and talk about what's going on in the community and help fill the gaps of the knowledge of the teachers and the administrators who, again, might have really good intentions but not necessarily have the base of information that they need.
So, number one, what is your perception of systematic racism? And what would you say to a white person who feels that there's no systematic racism that's
Well, first, let me start with sort of addressing what you were talking about with regard to the lawmakers, because I think their sort of dismissive attitude toward this potential legislation is rooted really in a couple of things, right? And one of them is the fact that, you know, they themselves as lawmakers, I'm speculating here, but I think I'm probably right on this, are people who themselves probably were never in school at a time when this conversation about culturally responsive practice was really part of the discussion. So to them, it's a totally foreign concept, right? To them, they think school is where you go and you learn math and you learn how to diagram a sentence and you learn chemistry and biology, and then you go to college or you go get a job. And to them, you know, education is just this sort of perfunctory thing that everybody's supposed to do so you can gain skills. But they're locked in a paradigm about what skills are needed. That's a very antiquated paradigm, right? Obviously, what you needed to know in 1975 is not the same as what you need to know in 2017. So if you've got lawmakers, you know, I graduated from high school in 1986. What I needed to know is different than what 31 years later we need to know, because we're living in a very different culture than we were, a more multicultural, more pluralistic society, a demographically different society, where within 30 years, half the students, well, actually already more than half the public school students in America are students of color. Within 30 years, half the people in the country are gonna be people of color. So in some regard, I think you have to sell this to them as less of a political and ideological issue, which of course it is. There are politics and ideology and philosophy involved in it, but it's really more about competence. It's really more about teacher quality. It's about, and not just teachers, principals and school board members. It's about saying, if you want to do your job well, you have to develop some skills and competencies that maybe you didn't know you had to develop. And we're really sorry you didn't know that. And we're really sorry that wasn't part of the originally negotiated union contract. But if you want to do your job really better than you're doing it and reach all kids, which I believe most teachers and most principals and most school board members are good folks who want to do right by children, but they don't even have a sense of what that means in 2017. So number one is you have this learned ignorance that comes from the fact that they grew up in environments where this wasn't really important. So you have to lead them to that, and it takes a minute. The second thing is it's rooted in white privilege, right? Because the reality is that being white, even if these are folks who are not overtly racist and not consciously bigoted or prejudiced in any way, if you're coming from a white paradigm where schools were set up for you, I mean, schools in this country were set up for white, middle class, and above people. And historically, of course, for men as well, but specifically for white, middle class, and above people. So if that was the paradigm of public education, so much so that people of color were excluded from it entirely in many communities, or once it was integrated, they were still put into very different tracks and, as you said, disciplined differently. So if the system was set up for you, it creates a lens in your going back to that issue of vision. It's an interesting analogy, right? This young woman talking about eye test and vision test. Like, vision is a lot of things. It's not just what your eyeballs actually see. It's the lens that you wear as you survey the stuff of everyday existence. And if these folks are wearing a lens that to them seems perfect, like, it's like if I put your glasses on, I won't be able to see anything if those are prescription. I don't know. They might just be because they look good. I don't know why you wear glasses, but you know, some folks will have a prescription, and to them, like, they see perfectly. I put on those glasses and I'm like falling all over the place because I'm dizzy and they're not made for me. So we have different lenses for white Americans, particularly white American lawmakers, and I think white American teachers and principals. Even if they mean to do the right thing, if we have a particular lens that distorts our vision, we don't see what black and brown folks see. We don't see what working class and lower income folks of any color see if we're middle class or above. And it doesn't mean that we have the bad intentions. It means that we're oblivious to the lived experience of this group over here or that group over here, which means that if we're going to deal with systematic racism, we have to be prepared to unpack that. Now, as far as the actual question that you asked about systemic racism, I think that the thing that differentiates systemic racism from old-fashioned racism, what people tend to think of when you say that word. And when you say racism, people think about bigots and hateful people and overtly biased. And I mean, there are people like that, of course. There are people like that in every community. There are people like that maybe in every school. There might be people like that in every legislature. I have no doubt there are. But the real problem is this systematic, institutional kind of racism that oftentimes doesn't have racist intent behind it. But if you have a policy, I mean, we just give a few examples. So we know that in state after state and school district after school district, the most experienced teachers, the ones with the most qualifications, the ones that majored in the subject that they teach, disproportionately are able to get placements in schools that are overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly affluent. And the students of color and working class and lower income students end up usually having the teachers that have 1 or 2 years of experience. They're less likely to have majored in the subject that they're teaching, so they are technically less experienced and less qualified. Now, some of those teachers are still great teachers, don't get me wrong, but if you have a school packed with sort of novice teachers, right, and a lot of them burn out after 2 or 3 years on average and end up leaving, what you're doing is you're sending a message to those children of color and low-income students that you don't deserve the best teachers in the system. You don't deserve the ones who have a track record, a proven track record. So that's one example. Is that deliberate? No, I don't think that most of those teachers who are looking for those assignments are saying, like, I don't want to teach black children, I don't want to teach Latino children, but they're saying, they're using their seniority and their tenure to sort of get some of those placements, and principals go along with it, school districts go along with it. Secondly, you know, if you have schools disproportionately funded by property tax, we know what the effect of that is nationwide. So you have areas with more property value, more affluent areas that are disproportionately white are going to have more money per pupil. And yes, the states have their own funding formula where they try to make up for that. But the problem is, even if you equalize the funding, like, you know, because everybody would say, oh, well, if you have equal funding for every student, everybody, you know, every student's getting $5,000 a year in state money in effect, you know, for their education. The problem with that is if I'm an affluent student and you're paying $5,000 a year for my education, and over here is a poor student and you're paying $5,000, and they're in a poor school with 60% low income, free and reduced price lunch, they're gonna need more. Equal is not gonna be equitable, right? So if you have equal funding, it's not equitable, because these folks over here are dealing with more stuff. Their teachers are gonna need more resources, not the same. So that may seem fair to somebody whose lens is this sort of normative thing of like, well, we just want to treat everyone the same.
So how do we help them change that lens? Like, 'cause, I mean, these are people in position in power. So, for example, like a school board member. I was able to attend a school board forum, a voting forum, because it's a race going on right now for a seat. And one of the questions was to the two candidates. One was white, one was black. The question was, if you had a student, an African American student, who felt uncomfortable in the classroom, what would you do to help this student feel more comfortable? And the white candidate said that, well, she said, well, I'm white. So I don't know. Basically, she was like, she doesn't know. And
that was like her out.
She doesn't know how to make this particular student feel comfortable. So this is the mindset of many white educators. And again, like what pure intentions, like I don't think it was her intentions like to, you know,
well, and in effect, she's sort of acknowledging her blindness, her obliviousness, her privilege, but then she's allowing that to paralyze her instead of figuring, because I mean, the most basic answer to that question, even if you don't understand race and critical race theory, even if you don't understand culturally responsive practice, if I'm just a teacher, if you were to ask me, so if you ask a question, there's a student in your class, and you don't mention the race, right? You just say there's a student in your class and they're feeling uncomfortable. What would you do? She would have an answer, right? And the answer would have something to do with like sitting down and talking to them, finding out what's going on. Why is that answer any different? You would do the same thing, but now what you would need to do, I think, if you're a white teacher with a student of color, or if you're a middle class and above teacher with a low income student who you know is struggling economically, you have to be sensitive to that specific struggle. And you have to be, I think, transparent enough to acknowledge, because that kid, I don't know, you know, how old this presumptive child will be, but let's say that child is in middle school. Well, by the time black and brown children are in middle school, they are firmly aware about racism. They are firmly aware about the stereotypes that teachers hold about them. So if I'm gonna be effective with that child who maybe is sitting there looking at me as a teacher and thinking, I don't think this white person, even if they're a good person, I like Miss Jones or I like Mr. Smith or whatever, but I don't think they really see me. I don't think they really get me. I don't think they really understand me. If they already think that about me, and they have good reason to think that, I need to be honest enough when I sit down with them to own that and be like, I know you probably think that I don't know what the hell you're experiencing, and you're right. So that's why we need to have a conversation and we need to build some trust, and I need to know what you need from me. I asked the 12-year-old, what do you need in order to feel right in this classroom? What do I need to do? And I need to do that, be honest enough about my own ignorance. And I think a lot of times teachers and administrators and principals are afraid to admit that they don't know something in front of a child, right? Because you're supposed to be the expert. That's why you're the teacher and they're learning from you. But the reality is they need to know that you don't have all the answers and that we're gonna create the answers in the classroom, in the school building. That's how you're gonna build trust. And I don't know why any teacher can't understand. I mean, that seems basic to me.
And what that is, what you just said is culturally responsive practice, because you're responding to the needs of your population, of your students. That's exactly what it is. It's responsive, okay? So that leads me to the next question. So what can white educators do to unpack their white privilege and recognize and make a difference in the educational system? And I want you to answer this from I'm gonna say 4 different perspectives.
Okay.
The first perspective, I'm gonna say all the way from, let's start with a school board member, then a superintendent, a principal, and then a classroom teacher.
Okay. So I think a school board member needs to be very clear that when they're setting policy for a school district, that a couple things that they need to make sure they're doing. Number one is that even when they're campaigning for that school board position and trying to get on the school board, that they need to be leading with a conversation, particularly in underserved and minoritized and marginalized communities. And I hate that term, underserved. I can't believe I just used it, but that's why I corrected it with marginalized and diminished communities that have been injured by economic and racial oppression. They need to go to those communities and be transparent and open about the things that they don't know. Part of unpacking your white privilege is admitting the stuff that you don't know. Now, on the one hand, it's hard to know what you don't know, but you know there are things that you're not aware of. You know there are blind spots that you have. So if I'm gonna run for school board, if I'm gonna serve on the school board, I need to go into the communities that have the greatest need, admit my blind spots, ask folks how I can serve them best, and be humble enough to take that input and to take that response, because part of white privilege is not having to listen to those voices. So if I actually train myself and force myself to be in a position where I have to listen, then that's unpacking my privilege as a potential school board member. And it means that I need to filter every policy that we discuss. Once I'm on the school board, every policy we discuss, I need to be filtering through a racial equity lens and a cultural equity lens, which means I need to be asking every time there's a discussion about resources, every time there's a discussion about placements of principals, every time there's a discussion about facilities and where we're gonna spend the money to improve facilities first and all that. That has to be done through a lens of racial equity, or maybe like a racial impact statement, right? That says, what is the impact of this gonna be on this community and this group versus that group? If I'm doing that, if I'm forcing myself to use that lens, then I'm unpacking a certain degree of my own privilege, or at the very least, I'm building a firewall, right, between my privilege and the injury that my privilege might do. I mean, the short answer to your question for all of these groups, you unpack your white privilege by interrogating your own history and interrogating your own story. But to get more specific, right, I think you have to some extent build firewalls between your default position, which is to remain oblivious, and the injury that can be done when you bring that position out into the world, because you're still going to have your privilege. It's a question of how do you minimize the damage that it does. So that's for school board. For principals, superintendents. Superintendents have to be very clear when they come into the position. 2 things. Number 1, that racial equity is a priority. Number 2, that particularly if they're white, that part of racial equity is that white folks have to unpack and interrogate the privileges, the assumptions, the obliviousness that we have. And if the superintendent sends that message, I mean, think about how powerful it would be for a superintendent in a school district to say to all the employees, look, we've got to unpack our obliviousness. And our obliviousness is different depending on who we are. So there's white privilege, there's also male privilege, there's also straight privilege, there's also class privilege, right? So every group that is the quote unquote norm needs to be, if they're gonna create real equity in the classroom, you gotta unpack all of those. It's not just white privilege, it's all of these forms of privilege if you're gonna create real equity and cultural responsive teaching. So if I'm the superintendent, the way I do that is I send a message that this is gonna be a priority for me. I'm going to expect my principals, I'm going to expect my teachers to do this. Whether the state can make it mandatory or not, if I'm the superintendent, I will strongly encourage and figure out potentially ways to reward reward those who do it, because I can build in incentive structures within my district, for, or within the district where I'm the superintendent to go a certain distance and to make certain outcomes happen. Even if I can't make it mandatory, I can incentivize it. So that for me would be what a superintendent would do. At the level of principals are critical. I mean, one of the things we know is you can get all the teachers in a building trained, theoretically, and on the same page. But if their person in command, if their head person in that office, who's the principal, is not down for that and not really behind that, they can undermine everything that happens, because the principal's gonna be breathing down the neck of the teacher to stay on task, to do what the state standards are, to make sure you're meeting the state standards in this particular time frame. Whereas when you're doing culturally responsive practice, you may have to go around the block a minute to get to the state standard. You're going to get there, and this will actually help you get there, but it may not be the way that the state laid it out. It may be that you have to divert a little bit from your normal curriculum and your normal way of doing things in order to reach everybody. So I need a principal that's prepared to do that, and a principal who's prepared to say to all the teachers in their building, we together are going to interrogate the things that we don't know. We're going to ask these hard questions. We're going to humble ourselves enough to go into the community and find out from the people what they need from us, and what it is that we don't know that we need to know. And for the teacher, it means really going back to interrogating all the stuff that they did not learn in their teacher training program, whether that was an alternative cert program or whether that was a formal ed program at a college or university. Figuring out all the things that they didn't have to learn. Because most teachers will tell you, right, that they didn't really have to take any classes in the process of becoming certified to deal with multicultural education, equity practice, culturally responsive teaching. They might have taken a elective class. They might have had one class in their whole, but it wasn't required. It was voluntary thing, and they didn't necessarily get the skills and the tools that they need. So for teachers, I need the teachers to be, again, transparent enough to own, and not just to themselves, but to own to the students and the parents. I've told this story before in sessions that we've been in together about a friend of mine, white teacher in New York City, somebody I went to school with in Tennessee, who ends up becoming a teacher in the Bronx. And she gets her certification. She's white. She's going to be at a school in the South Bronx. She's a white woman with a Southern accent, and clearly out of place, right? And my advice to her when she told me where she was going to be going, I said, if you really want to reach students, you have to be as honest with them about your ignorance as they already know you are, right? In other words, they're going to see you walk in, and they are going to know the minute you walk in that you don't know where the hell you're at. You've never been in a place like this. You're probably scared to death because you're out of your element. You need to own that. You need to be the first one to walk in there and go, I know this is crazy, right? Like, why would they send me up here? Because that's what every one of those kids is thinking. And if you're honest enough to admit that and to say, like, yeah, this is sort of a setup. Like, they set y'all up because I've never taught before. So they don't even care if I can reach you. And they set me up because they don't care if I quit. And if you be honest with the students about the way this system is structured and what is going on, then they'll respond to you because they'll see you as having integrity. They'll also see you as being willing to take a joke about yourself and not take yourself so seriously. Right, and that level of honesty, I think, is what teachers in the classroom can do.
You know what? All this sounds excellent, and basically what you're saying is intentions. Right. So one of our domains is high expectations, and that's having intentions and having a belief. So again, white privilege, you have the privilege to not respond to everything that you said and how they should respond. They still have a privilege to be like, well, I don't need to say any of this. I don't need to do any of that, everything that you just said. And but people who, basically what you said is the ones who have the intentions to want to bring about change. So again, I feel, and during this political time, during this time and this that we're in, how can we begin to activate the ones that are comfortable with their privilege? They're in position of power. They may be a school board member. They may be a senator, a representative. They may be a school principal. They may be a teacher. But they still have the privilege not to respond.
Well, I think there are two things, two ways of sort of approaching it, right? And one is you've already talked about, which is obviously trying to get some type of legislation passed that would not necessarily remove the choice of obliviousness, because you probably can't make it mandatory, but would certainly incentivize and push for this kind of expertise as a requirement, as something that you're supposed to get. Because then you remove the option of remaining oblivious or remaining in that bubble. So that's number one, and I applaud you for working on that and keep trying it. You know, Washington State tried that back in the day in '01, actually, when No Child Left Behind was passed. The Washington Association of Multicultural Educators and a few other groups got together and actually went to the education department, because they were fielding out all these, they were asking for grants to be written, grant proposals for how you and your state are gonna make sure you leave no child behind. And so these anti-racist educators were like, well, we think the thing that's leaving them behind is racism, so we're gonna write a grant. They got money from the Department of Education to actually create a rubric for racial equity in the states. But of course, the state legislature didn't pass it. So it's the same thing that y'all are dealing with in a sense, right? But it's always worth coming back to, because here's the deal. Even if they don't pass it, what happened was you still got a rubric, right? So even if it doesn't become law, you've developed this thing, right? You've developed, in a sense, a product. And I hate to talk about it in terms of products, because this is not a you know, sort of a commodity, but you have created a usable, workable product that you can then take into the schools. And you can find maybe a handful, even if you just find, think about it, a handful of teachers and principals who are amenable to this. Let's say you focus in like a laser on a couple of schools where you know you've got some people in place who are about this. You got a principal that's about it, you got some teachers that are about it, and you know that they are willing to do some stuff. Well, now if you've got a rubric, no, you can't make every teacher do it, but if I'm the principal and you bring that rubric to me and say, hey, we'd like for you to administer this and see where your teachers are in terms of their competence level, just as an indicator, not as a, oh, if you fail it, you're fired or whatever, but just as we just want to know where we're at. The same rationale we say we give student standardized tests for, right? Because standardized tests at their best are intended to tell you what you need to do better. Unfortunately, we use them as a gatekeeping mechanism for opportunities, and that's where it goes off the rails. But if we said to the principals, let's focus in on a couple of schools, we're gonna use that as an incubator. So we're gonna find a couple of places where we're gonna push this hard, and we're gonna get support for it, and we're gonna get this thing off the ground and incubate this, and then within 3-4 years, it may take a minute, but in 3-4 years, if you start to see some movement, right? Now you get other schools in the district who see that. And I might be one of those teachers at one of those schools or one of those principals that isn't really down yet, and they think, oh, this is silly, this is nonsense, what does that have to do with anything? But if I see that you're making moves at a different school using this rubric, I might think to myself, well, I want to get on that bandwagon now because I see that it's working. So if you create a good example, right, and you create a model of what it can be by focusing in on a couple of schools, even if the state doesn't mandate it, you get other schools and principals that are like, I want to be part of that, right? Because folks want to get on the train once it's moving in that direction. They're afraid to be the first one to go. But if you can find somebody to go first and incubate this stuff, I think you'll have some success.
Do you guys have any questions? Let me talk to the live audience. You guys have any questions out there?
The initial debate around civil rights in education was simply breaking, sort of separate and unequal. So this idea was obviously somewhat limited in the sense of we want to have desegregated schools, which presumptively will provide more opportunity to Black and brown kids. Of course, the paradigm that was in place there, the problem with this, it wasn't that was a bad idea, obviously it was, but it was partial. It's the same thing as integrating lunch counters, right? Or integrating department stores or integrating movie theaters. Like, okay, those are all really important things to do because they tell you something about where you're at as a society, but integrating a lunch counter if folks can't afford the food doesn't really get you equity. Or integrating the school if the folks still are not getting the food of the curriculum that they need to inspire them, or culturally responsive practice that will really inspire them and lift them to a different place, then all you've done is sort of mix up the chairs in the room and you've colorized the room, but you haven't really created the core fundamental equity. And the other thing that we moved from was this mentality of that Black and brown families historically had within the educational system, because if you're Black or brown under separate but unequal, you know that the purpose of education has to be communal. It has to be about community uplift. It can't just be about getting an education so you can get a good job, because under segregation, you weren't going to be able to get the good job. So there was a collective, almost like revolutionary purpose to education under segregation. And when we did integration, rather than integrating philosophies and making it about collective uplift and about communal improvement, it just became about hyper-individualism. So now we end up with desegregated schools, but the teaching mentality is school is where you go so you can go to college, so you can get a good job, so you can make more money. It's lost that communal, collective, political, even revolutionary aspect. And that, I think, is sort of put us behind in a sense of having to, relitigate a lot of these issues because we're still using an outdated paradigm, a very outdated paradigm.
Someone had asked, they was like, so was colorblind institutionalized?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that ever since the era of desegregation, the problem was we did integration without equity. It became colorblind. The mentality seemed to be, well, let's just integrate the schools and then we don't have to actually talk about color anymore because we're going to have black and white kids together. We're going to have Latino and Asian kids and white and black kids together. And so we don't have to really actively talk about it. And I talk about this in my book, White Like Me, in my own school. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, and went to probably the most integrated schools within the Nashville public school cluster. So I was in schools that were about 40% black. And at my high school, black and white kids got together pretty well, got along pretty well, but there were also lots of racial tensions that were with some of the Southeast Asian kids who had come post-1975. We ended up having a race riot at my school senior year, even though we were this, really good school, quote unquote. We were a school where you didn't have a lot of racial tension, but you did because these folks who had come in, we didn't know anything about them. And they didn't know anything about us, and the school didn't talk about it. The school didn't actually sit us down and say, hey, we need to get to know the cultures of these Southeast Asian kids, these Thai kids, Lao kids, Hmong kids, Vietnamese kids, and they need to get to know us. We need to actually build some relationships. It was just a colorblind mentality, and the problem was when you have a colorblind mentality, you got the stuff under the surface that's still bubbling up. You can't address it. You can't solve problems of racial disparity, racial inequity, or racial bias unless you get them out in the open. And I'm afraid that most schools are still locked into that colorblind mode. The idea is teachers believe, well, this is the way we teach. This is the proper way to teach. Well, the way that you teach a kid who goes home to a family that has, plenty of money and net worth and takes vacations every year and got a couple cars in the driveway and doesn't have to sweat, their rent or their mortgage or the food or the medical bill. It's a very different way to teach that child, frankly, than the child who's struggling against stuff, who is in a neighborhood with a high crime rate, high poverty rate, stuff going on in the family that's drama and dysfunction. And you've got to be able to reach to that child's actual experience. You can't just assume that because this thing works for this kid over here who's got all these advantages, that it's going to work for this kid who doesn't. That doesn't mean that this kid over here can't learn. This kid over here can absolutely learn, but you're gonna have to use some different methods of reaching that child because that child is up against stuff that this child over here is not. And that means you have to be color conscious, and you have to be class conscious, and you have to be gender conscious. You have to be conscious of all these different identities that get in the way of equity. And if you just treat everyone like they're basically interchangeable, you're ignoring their actual lived experience, which makes no sense. Right. Well, I think the problem for younger people, right, is that because we've been locked into this sort of colorblind and color mute, where we just don't talk about race, where we're not supposed to talk about race. We've been in that motif for so long that a lot of kids, white kids and kids of color, are sort of not as aware as they ought to be about the way that structures operate, right? I mean, we've never been really good as a country about seeing how systems work. We tend to always individualize these things. So we think of racism as an individual thing. We think of sexism as an individual thing. We don't really see how systems and structures operate because we're not taught to. Unless you get to college and take like a sociology class, you don't learn that stuff in K-12. You normally, it's all on the interpersonal level. So we have to do a better job of that because right now, particularly in a global environment where young people have got all kinds of means of communication and they feel very connected to one another, right? It allows you to have a false sense of security because you've got kids that are, they're sharing a multicultural. I mean, we have a culture now as a country that is thoroughly multicultural, from the food we eat to the music we listen to the clothes we wear to the art that we appreciate. I mean, there is, for young people in particular, a greater pluralistic appreciation of the other than ever before, but that can create a false sense of security. It can create a false sense of security for kids of color who think, oh, well, my buddy over here who's white listens to the same music I listen to, so we're cool, everything's good, but they don't actually go to each other's house, right? And they don't actually, and their parents don't actually know each other, and they don't actually socialize outside of the school, and they don't live in the same part of town, and they don't face the same kind of problems with police, but we hang out in the cafeteria so it's all good, or we hang out on the playground so it's all good, or we have the same sort of interests. And the problem is it's a lot deeper than that. So and for white kids, it creates a false sense of security, because the white kid figures like, well, I'm not racist because my buddy over here who's black, or I date an Asian woman, or whatever, and not realizing how unimportant that is. I mean, it's important, but how unimportant that is in terms of really ensuring that you aren't perpetuating racism. I mean, men perpetuate sexism even when they're straight and marry women. So it's like, if I'm married to a woman, I can still be a sexist. If I have a friend who's black, I can still be racist. I can still be implicated in the perpetuation of racism. And I think a lot of young people don't have the lens to see that, because we have parents who have been trying to maintain those children's innocence a lot. You see this more with white parents, but you see it sometimes with parents of color too, who don't want to talk to their kids about oppression, right? Because they're afraid if I tell them that, it's going to sort of cripple them from the start, right? It's going to make them feel like a victim. But the reality is, the research is clear. By 8, 9 years old, black children are fully aware of the stereotypes held about their group. So if I'm the parent and I don't talk to them, if I don't talk them through that, if I don't help them process that, right, then they're going to already know, and they're going to be internalizing that stuff. So the parent of color has to have the conversation, the teachers have to have the conversation, and white parents have to have the conversation. 75% of white parents, according to research, never talk about race with their children.
Wow.
So if you have, and 75% of parents of color do. So if you have 3/4 of black and brown parents that have that talk, and it might be the talk about how you respond to a cop, or it might be, how you respond to a teacher, and 3 out of 4 white parents are never having the conversation, you could have those white and black kids be real good friends in school, but we're not even having the same discussion. I mean, we're not, the research finds that white folks who have black friends want to just chill and do what they do with their white friends and hang out, but they don't want to talk about the elephant in the room, which ultimately becomes an issue. It became an issue for me. I went to, like I said, schools that were 45% black. Most of my friends early on were black kids. By the time we got to high school, though, that's not who I hung out with. And I wasn't who they hung out with, because we had 8, 9 years of such fundamentally different treatment systemically. Yeah, we played ball in the summer, and we played, ball in the gym, or we hung out on campus. But after school, we didn't. And so by the time we get to 9th grade, 10th grade, we're still cool with each other, but we're not really hanging out and doing things because we've had such a different experience. So I think unless kids have a way to talk about that and have a school system that encourages them to talk about that, they're going to continue to be in this sort of naive realm of thinking everything is all right when it's really not. Well, I don't think the country's going to survive. I mean, I don't, in any recognizable form, in any form that we would want. Because, we're coming up, like I said before, we're coming up on a period here in 30 years where half the people in this country are going to be folks of color. Already over half of the students in public schools nationwide are kids of color, and overwhelmingly now over half are working class or below. And so if you've got a school system that is working class, and you have a school system that is disproportionately black and brown, and you're not fully educating those people, the economy doesn't survive, the culture doesn't survive, the political system doesn't survive. So we're talking about really sort of life and death stuff in the sense of the culture, life and death. But what we're also talking about is we're gonna have to radically shift the way that we do schooling, just like the way that we do policing. I mean, I've talked about this for the last several years, that bottom line, down the road, we're gonna have to get to a place where communities are self-determined in terms of who teaches their children. I believe that parents of color, communities of color, and working class communities of all colors need to be able to determine who's going to teach and administrate in their children's schools. I mean, they deserve the right to pick them. It isn't just about passing a test and you get assigned by the school district. I believe that communities have to be able to decide who is responsive to the needs of my child. Just like I think communities need to be able to pick the cops who are going to work in that community. And I mean, that means if you're a teacher or an aspiring police officer, you got to spend, let's say, 90 days in a probationary period getting to know the community. So let's say I want to teach. We'll just talk about it in terms of teaching. If I want to teach at that school that's in a black or Latino neighborhood or a working class or poor neighborhood of whatever color, I have to spend the first 3 months. You put me on contract, fine, I'm getting a salary, whatever, I'm getting paid. But for the first 3 months, I'm not teaching yet. I'm going around the community, I'm getting to know people, I'm meeting families, I'm sitting with them at the barbershop, at the coffee shop, in the McDonald's, the Waffle House, whatever, going to the park, sitting and talking with families and parents, finding out, what do you need? I'm gonna be a teacher in a few months, if y'all will have me, and I need to know what you need me to do in order to meet the needs of your child. After 3 months, if I've been a good listener and I've really sort of humbled myself to the community and made it clear, then they're gonna have a chance to vote on me. And they're probably gonna vote for me. They're probably gonna say, yeah, I think he'd be pretty good. On the other hand, if I come in with all kinds of attitude, or I come in with this sense of like, I know all the answers, and then they might be like, no, we don't want that person, either as a teacher or as a cop. Ultimately, we've gotta have some self-determination in marginalized communities. We can't continue to make policy from the state or even the federal government. And this is sort of an interesting area where people who claim to be conservative, who like to say we want to put power at the local level, they don't really mean it, because power at the local level will be what I'm talking about. Power at the local level would be, okay, we're going to give, the school lunch and the school breakfast program back to the Panthers, right? Because they're the ones who started it, and instead the state took it over, and they gave all the food, but they didn't do the popular education piece that the Panthers did. So we're going to feed you your breakfast, and we're not going to tell you about yourself. And it's not to say it was a bad idea for the government to fund school lunch and school breakfast, but it lost that radical edge. And I think the same thing here. I believe in devolving school policy to the community, but I mean to the community, not to the state house, not to the school board, but to the actual community. And until we get to that, I don't know if we're really going to, get to where we need to be in terms of racial equity or class equity within our schools. But if we don't do something headed down that road, we're not, we got about 35 years. And then this whole thing is going to collapse.
Charity begins at home. So first to thyself be true, and thou canst not then depart to no man. Because God and nature first made us what we are. And out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Follow always that great law. Let God in the sky be our limit, and eternity our measure. There is no height to which you cannot climb without the active intelligence of your own mind. Mind create.
Yo, I was sitting in my living room, watching tell a lie, peeping at how they assume that we never gonna amount to nothing. And I can't blame them, just check out how much we be frontin'. Physically we free, but mentally worse than before. Society selling us slavery, no metaphor. Then I doze off, hoping that I find correction. Had a dream inside my dream, inception. Then I look into MG's eyes, not double M, I'm talking him who exposed lies. He told me, son, never ever let them change your mind, and never ever set to limit. Your limit is the sky. The limit's off, I'm going off. I count the cost. You got a problem with it, you can fall off or get lost. Yeah, first class with my seat back, journey to my freedom from the past, and I ain't looking back. Spread your arms out.
So we have a question here on the live feed. I'm listening. Sorry, I'm not.
Yeah. That's all good.
I'm multitasking, but So one of the questions is Dr. Tanya Love. She said, when we look at the legislative pertaining to culture-responsive practice measures and accountability, there seems to be a lot of pushback or fear involved. We've heard folks say, oh yeah, that's already being infused, it's already being done. Remember we talked about the buzzwords. Do you think the pushback may be more out of fear that schools aren't actually culturally responsive, or fostering equity, and perhaps even fear that you might call me a racist?
Well, it's probably both. I mean, I'm sure there's some fear about being exposed as not really doing it, especially since, like you said, this multicultural education piece has been in place since '99. So nobody wants to acknowledge that we've now gone almost 20 years and not really cracked that code, right? But it's also, I think, whenever you talk about culturally responsive practice, the implication in the ear of the teacher or the administrator or the school board member is, you're calling me culturally non-responsive, which is not a very big leap from that to thinking that you're being called racist. Now again, that's not what this is. Nobody's talking about, we're not calling anyone racist at the level of the individual. People that are not deliberately racist people do racist things and perpetuate racial inequity. Again, not always meaning to. I'm sure that there are people who fundamentally believe in the validity of standardized testing, for instance. And they have all kinds of reasons for believing in it that are not racist. I know the guy that's the head of the college board right now. He was a debater in high school when I was a debater 30 years ago. And you know, he's a good guy, and I don't think that he has any racist intentionality in terms of his support for the SAT and the tests that are connected to that organization. But the outcome of standardized testing in schools that are profoundly unstandardized, on students that are profoundly unstandardized in terms of their opportunities and access, is going to perpetuate racism. So we just need to get out of this mode. I'm sure people are afraid of it, but we need to get out of that mode by making it clear to people, this is not about racists. This is about racism as a system. And it's not about you. You know, it's like the old saying, this is not personal, it's business, right? And this is about the business of creating equity, and all of us from time to time fall into the traps that maintain inequity. The question is, are these foreseeable consequences? And you know, standardized testing, there's a foreseeable consequence. So we have to hold people accountable for that consequence. I'm sure there's a fear of it, but I think that fear is predicated on an ignorance about what cultural responsivity means, and a sense that this is all about politics and ideology, when really what this is about is competence. You're trying to make teachers better at what they do. And you would think that any professional given a tool to help them be better, like if right now, if I'm only reaching half the kids in my class, then I'm failing. Why is that? Why, you know, as a professional, I would feel horrible. I would feel like, you know what, I need to up my game, and anything you want to give me that's going to help me up my game as an educator is going to make me feel good. I would want to do that, even if I think maybe this is silly, I don't think it's going to work. Well, what do I have to lose? Because right now, whatever I'm doing isn't working, and we know that a vast majority of teachers who want to do right by kids, I think most teachers are really well intended, but if they're not reaching, if you think that reaching half or 60% of the kids is acceptable, you wouldn't accept that from a child to say, well, I got 60% of the answers right on the test. That's an F. That's an F in any school district. There's no curve, you know, that's a failure. So we have to have the same kind of mentality, and I think if we push this as professional competence, this is professional skill building. This is about making you, helping you get better at the thing that you do and that you love. Then I think some of those barriers and some of that fear might come down.
What do you say to those people in education who say, well, you know, poverty is more important than, you know, the racial issues?
Well, poverty is very important, and of course it's interconnected with race. So I mean, you can't disentangle those things entirely in this country because they've been linked for so long. We know right now, for instance, recent research came out that found that white household heads that dropped out of high school, didn't even finish high school, have twice the wealth on average of black households whose head is a college grad. So you got a black household head who has a college degree, they still have half the wealth of the white household that's headed by a high school dropout. So two things come to mind when you hear that, right? One, it can't all be about class, because here you've got the white person who didn't even finish high school, probably maybe doesn't make as much income, maybe doesn't have as good a job, but they have more wealth because they had a head start from family. They might have gotten a little house from their family or a little bit of intergenerational transfer, whatever. And the second thing that comes to mind is that we have to deal with the wealth disparities and the economic disparities too. I mean, they're both in the picture. But I think that to act as though it's only about poverty, if it were just about poverty, then here's the deal. You think about, you mentioned school discipline. We know the research says that black kids from upper middle class families who are not poor, not by a long shot, are more likely to be suspended or expelled from school than white kids who are from poor families. And it's not because they break the rules more. We know that the actual rates of school infractions are roughly identical across racial lines. There are a few areas that the rates are a little higher for blacks and a few areas where they're a little bit higher for whites, but they basically come out to be about the same. And certainly upper middle class black folks are breaking those rules less often than poor white folks, but they're being punished more harshly. So it can't just be about poverty. We know that upper middle class black folks actually do worse on the SAT than working class and low income white folks. So it can't just be about money. There must be something else going on. These are successful kids from successful families, right, that are doing well, but they're still underperforming. Why? Well, there's a lot of research on that. There's all this research that finds that, you know, especially for upper middle class black folks who were trying disprove the stereotype, right? Because if you're poor, you know you're up against a lot.
Right.
But if you're black and successful, you're constantly having to prove yourself against people who don't believe in you. And that creates stress. So the research on this thing called stereotype threat, Claude Steele, Josh Aronson, a few others who've done that work have found that when you are constantly trying to disprove a negative stigma, it creates additional stress when you sit down to take that test, because you're taking the test thinking, man, if I screw this up, right? If I screw this up, they're gonna think it's because I'm black. And so now you actually underperform. And they found, and the reason they proved that was they were able to take black and white folks that were equally capable, put them in 2 different rooms. Each room had some black and white in each room. And in the one room, they gave them a test, just like a real test. They said, look, we're gonna grade it. It's gonna tell us how prepared you are, good luck. And on the other room, same questions, same quality students. And they told them, we're not grading it. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't tell us anything. In the room where they told them it meant something, which is like a real world setting, the black kids underperformed. In the room where they said it didn't mean anything, they did just as well as the white kids. Why? Because over here, they're not stressed about proving a negative stereotype. They're not stressed about confirming a stigma. So if you got upper middle class kids who are still dealing with that and underperforming, and then that college admissions officer looks at the application and says, oh, you know, they don't have any excuse for that SAT score. I mean, they went to a prep school. What's wrong with them? And then they get put in the reject pile, even though they're just as capable according to the research. So poverty's an issue for sure for a lot of students in this country, millions of students. But racial inequity is also an issue, as is sex and gender inequity, et cetera.
And that's been an issue.
Of course.
It's been an issue historically and to present day. So again, we're faced with a lot of different oppositions in terms of pushing something like this to making it more accountable within the system. However, I agree with you in terms of the local and the self-determination. Like, you hit it on the nail with that. But at the same time, even in the midst of that self-determination, you're still faced again with the system. And again, we're making attempts of trying to turn the dial in terms of trying to change the system. However, we're still dealing with people's mindsets and beliefs.
Right.
And everything you said again goes back to what I said earlier about intentions.
Right.
And I just being a black male, I don't know how to, besides, putting on these different professional development opportunities for teachers, I don't know what else will activate them, even in the midst of this political time.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that I feel that this can be a golden time, even though it's a lot of disparities, a lot of crazy things that is happening during this time. But however, you hit it on the nail when you said that we can begin to activate. It's like right in front of our face, right? So even though it's right in front of our face, and we still have people in certain positions and positions of power who do not have these intentions whatsoever, and they may even come to your talk. They may come to the Tim Wise lecture tomorrow, and go back to their job and say, hey, I went to the Teaching with Purpose professional development event, but still have the same mindsets and have no intentions.
Yeah.
A key word, intentions, and that's been the theme that we've been highlighting from the first podcast we had and the second podcast. Principal Cavele talked about intentions. Dr. Doris McGuigan talked about intentions. And again, you're giving great examples of what a white person can do and unpacking their white privilege to make a difference. But again, it goes back to intentions. So, and then John hit it on the nail in terms of, okay, what do we need? The rubber hits the road in terms of, I think the main issue is that we still have people in power who have no intentions to make a difference.
Well, or here's the thing. I mean, or they might, but I can have, I got a lot of intentions, man. I intend to lose 30 pounds.
Yeah.
I intend to eat healthier. I intend to sleep more. I have all kinds of intentions to walk 5 miles a day. And you know what? Haven't done most of that yet, right? So it's not that I don't have the intention to do it. It's that I, for whatever reason, have not made the moves necessary to make those things happen.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that I don't mean it when I say it. It just means somewhere between what I'm intending to do and what I'm doing, something's happening. And what I think we need to provide to these folks who I'm just going to start off with the assumption, and it could be naive, but I'm going to start with the assumption that most people's intentions are good. They intend to do equity. They intend to do right by young people. They don't intend to marginalize and oppress people, even though I know there are some people who do. I don't think that's most people. I think most people have the right intention. But the problem is either they don't understand what it really requires to move from intent to action,
yes,
or they do understand and they're afraid that if they do it, it might not work, and then they'll be on the hook for the failure, or that they'll try it and there will be pushback from some other constituency. So if we start talking about, systemic racism and culturally responsive practice,
right,
are we going to have some white parents up in arms? Are we going to have some white lawmakers up in arms? And so we got to hold people's hand through this, and I hate doing that, because on the one hand, I think people just need to get with the program. The risks are too high, but the reality is, if I'm coming from a place of utter obliviousness on this, it's going to take me a minute to get up to speed. And that's why I think it's important if you can identify some spaces, some school sites to really incubate this, and really just drill down on that. I mean, you got to keep doing the programs where you offer the training to as many people as possible, and you've seen how that's grown, as you said, in just the last couple of years. But also, just as a real hardcore proposition, drill down in one or two particular sites and say, listen, this is going to be the model for this, and we need you to commit to 3, 4, 5 years of really intentional practice, and we're going to help you in terms of what that means. We're going to help you develop what that means. We're going to have, you have us on speed dial, so if you have a question, you call us anytime, and we'll come and help you with that. This is really going to be experimental, and I think if it's sold that way, if it's sold as an opportunity, this is not punishment for having done it wrong all those years. This is an opportunity to do something really special and really exciting. It's the stuff that all the charter school advocates always talk about, but they don't usually mean, right? They don't usually mean real experimentation. They don't really mean talking about liberatory pedagogy. They don't really mean talking about creating real equity. But if you can find some schools, whether it's a charter or a traditional school, that's willing to drill down and do this stuff, then that becomes a model that other people can copy. And it becomes a model that then when you go to sell it to somebody, you're not selling them a product that they don't know if it's going to work or not. It's not like going and selling them some elixir that you promise will, solve their hair loss or whatever. You actually have evidence. Like, look, we did this, and here's the outcomes that we have. We, whether it's increase in the attendance rate, whether it's a reduction in disciplinary problems, whether it's more kids graduating on time and going to college, whatever. You can come up with all types of metrics that will show that even just the level of engagement, right? If you have a couple schools that really take that on, and then you get the students and the families, the parents in that school to go to the school board and talk about the amazing stuff that's happening at that school. At that point, the only people who are going to remain resistant are going to be the people who are fundamentally ideologically opposed to equity, because the rest of them are going to want to hop on the ship. So I think that there are ways to really just sort of focus in. You keep trying to get state legislation and you keep doing all the stuff you've been doing, but really just pick a couple of places where you think you got the most traction with the most people involved, and say, let's create this as a model. And once we do that, then I think all bets are off as far as that resistance is concerned. There'll still be some, but I think you'll start to see that melt once people can go, because then those colleagues at the second school or the third school can go to their colleagues and friends at the first school and say, what is it y'all are doing that seems to be working so well, and how can we model that? How do we copy that?
You said a lot of buzzwords, a lot of key words, and one of the buzzwords that popped up to me was incentive and opportunities. And once we create these hubs, right, these models and these commitments of people who have intentions, and we begin to see results and see change, and document that change, and present that change to platforms like you said, the school board, and even to our legislators. The key word was opportunity. So when people begin to see, when they begin to have incentives. So even I think the incentives has to be systematic too, because when we go back to what you had mentioned in terms of funding and being equitable, maybe it needs to be some type of special allocation for those who are being intentional.
Absolutely, and yeah, exactly. I mean, and this may require, and I'm sure it would, probably renegotiation within union contracts as they currently are written, which is going to face some opposition as well. But if there's a way to say, listen, we're going to incentivize success on cultural responsive practice, and if you can demonstrate competence in this area, then you're going to get, whether it's a financial bonus, whether it's flex time, whether it's sabbatical time, whether it's, you know, money to go to a conference that the school puts up where you get to go and participate in a conference, you know, and sometimes these incentives don't have to be huge and monetary. You know, I've told a story before, maybe in your presence, where, you know, I was at a school in Columbus, Indiana, small size school district. And they were doing an event where I was doing a training with the teachers, and before my presentation, they got everybody together in the auditorium, and they just gave out these like awards, like plaques, right? It was just like a recognition, and what they did is they recognized these two particular teachers, one of whom had taken it upon herself to go and learn Spanish because there had been an influx of Spanish-speaking students in the district. And she wanted to be able to communicate with them. Now, they didn't make her do that, and they weren't gonna pay her extra to do it. She went out of pocket, paid her own money, but they recognized her for having done it. And then there was another teacher who learned sign language because there were 3 deaf kids in the school that she wanted to be able to communicate with, right? Without having to have them read lips or write stuff down. She wanted to actually be able to learn sign language and communicate. And so they recognized her, they gave her a plaque. Now here's what's interesting about that. That's a pretty moderate incentive. That's you know, it's just a plaque. I mean, what's the big deal? But the deal is, people were coming up to her after. And both of those women, the one that learned Spanish and the one that took ASL, American Sign Language, and we're asking, how do I take that class? Hey, where do they offer that class? Where can I get involved in that? Because they realized, and maybe they were doing it because they want a plaque, or maybe they were doing it because they realized, wow, you know, if that person went the extra mile, why can't I go the extra mile? It's the same kind of concept here, right? If we incentivize, whether it's, I'd love it to be monetary, but if the union contracts make that harder, there are other ways to incentivize success in this area to where other teachers, maybe who aren't successful with it yet, they see their colleagues being successful, now they want to be successful.
Right. Those who are listening to this podcast, you guys heard some great suggestions, some great, I would say some great professional development in a sense that can help, hopefully this can help change and shift your paradigm and shift your intentions. And like you said, you know, we have intentions to do a lot of things, but the next step is the action step, right? So, and that kind of ties into our domains of what we want to measure, of high expectations, relationships, and content. To me, that's thought, that's action, and then that's word, and then that's action, right? So yeah, the thought is the intentions. So we have the thought, we have the mindset, we know what's happening. So right now, it's like the thought is like, we have Donald Trump. Like racism is right in your face, okay? That's the thought, okay? Yeah. So the next thing is now, the next part is the relationship, and that's word, okay? So now, okay, what are you going to do in terms of what your thought is and what you realize and what you are conscious of? So what is your next step? The next step is begin to put it in word and then put it into action, and that's the next step. So hopefully those of you who are listening, you know, begin to take those action steps. You know, get involved with Teaching with Purpose, get involved with the NAACP, get involved with other groups to really try to bring about change systematically. That is our mission, that's our goal. Not only is our goal to change your mindset and to shift the way you teach and to change the way you teach, to be more responding to your students and families so you can empower them. So that's the key word, is empowerment. That's we teach to empower. Once you shift to do that, we got to begin to start looking at the system, begin to start changing the system. So get involved. Support Senate Bill 204. Learn more about it. Have a discussion. Get involved into our town halls, and where we're discussing and having more deep conversations about what this Senate bill is all about and what it can actually do in terms of changing the system. So begin, not only just have the thought, okay, begin to move into action and to chart and strive to make a difference. And that's what Teaching with Purpose is. Teaching with purpose. Teach with a purpose. The purpose in mind is to empower. We are faced with a lot of different disparities. We all know that. Okay, it's nothing new. It's nothing new under the sun. but we have to begin to start shifting and changing the paradigm of how we think and what we actually are doing in terms of our actions. So that is the summary of our third episode of our podcast, Unpacking White Privilege. I'm gonna title this. That's the title of this podcast, is how do we unpack white privilege? And unpack all of our privileges, right? And in a sense of activating ourselves, being more intentional about what we want to see in terms of education and in terms of having a more equitable educational system, and begin to move into action. So again, thank you. And do you have any closing words in terms of this podcast?
I'm good.
All right, so thank you guys for tuning in, and tune in next time for our fourth episode of the Teaching with Purpose podcast. Our series is called Cracking the Code. We're trying to crack the code of this educational system to bring about change. So thank you for listening. Until next time.
Suffering, struggling, hustling, yeah. Just to get by, so many battles we had to fight, just for the right to be something.